Welcome to the LS Community Church podcast. We're a church located in Lee's Summit, Missouri, that is dedicated to making disciple makers who saturate our city and the world with the gospel. For more information, check out our website at lscckc.org. Thanks for listening.
So yes, as Kevin said, we are in the story, chapter 20, finally. I think I said that wrong last week, so maybe chapter 20, part 2. We are in the only book of the Bible that does not mention the name of God. So when you read through the book of Esther, God seems silent, absent, missing. He's just not mentioned, and yet his fingerprints are all over the book. And so maybe you're here today and you're in a season where you really wish God would be a touch more loud and clear. Kind of like last week, you're like, man, I got this thing going on, and God, I really wish that you would be a little bit more obvious in what I'm supposed to do, but maybe you're in a season where God is silent, and you're kind of at this place of like, well, now what do we do? Now what am I supposed to do? And maybe those decisions for you are really big, you know? They may be relationship decisions, marriage decisions, college, career, family things that are just iffy at best. And you're like, God, I really wish you would just be crystal clear about what it is I'm supposed to do. And yet it just kind of seems like whatever situation you're in, God just remains silent. And if you're in that place, or you can remember the last time you were, or maybe you're in that season today and God just seems silent to you, I think it's great that you're here. Because the big idea for us as we walk our way through the story of Esther is this: to stay faithful, remain faithful, even when God is silent. So if you were here last week, we said, stay faithful when God is loud and clear. And over and over and over last week, God made it abundantly clear what he was trying to accomplish. And today you won't even hear his name when you read through the book of Esther. It's just this stark drop-off of, why is God all of a sudden so silent? So in the story, as you might be able to imagine, the storybook itself, which looks like this, takes the Bible, puts it into these 31 key stories, and so there's some of the passages that are left out. The story is just meant to kind of connect the dots between big moments in the Bible. But when you get to Esther, almost the entire book of Esther is in here. So if you're a big fan of the book of Esther, basically all of it is in here except for like chapter 10. And so if you really need chapter 10 also, you can get that in your actual Bible. But in the story, it covers almost 100% of the story of Esther. And what that means for us is that I have to talk fast because all of the details are in there this week. And other weeks, it kind of skips a bunch of stuff. And so you can kind of play around with it. This week, it's all there. So we're going to move somewhat quickly as we try to discern how to stay faithful when God is silent. So before we dive in, we're going to pray, ask God to lead us, and then we'll dig in. Father, we pause and we come before you humbly, and we ask, God, that you would speak to us through your word, through this story of Queen Esther. God, for those of us in the room who may be in a season where you seem abnormally silent, would you help us to be able to discern next steps that we should be taking as we do our best to hear you and to obey? Father, be with us in our time. We love you so much. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. So we're going to break this down into kind of 4 key parts that happen in the book of Esther. And the very first of those kind of key parts is Esther's coronation. So now what's happening is you have the Jewish people who are in exile in Persia. But if you were here last week, you remember that the Persian king said, if you want to go home, go home. Rebuild your temple. God is telling me I need to do this. And he sends them home. Not all of the Jews went. Some of them stayed in Persia. And you can imagine after a certain amount of time when you've grown up in a certain culture that you kind of get adapted to that place, and maybe where you're supposed to go home doesn't feel like home anymore because you're adjusted to a new culture. And many of the Jews felt that way. We're free to go home. We don't want to. We want to stay here in Persia. Now, as the story begins, the king, we'll call him King Xerxes. That's the easier way to pronounce his name. But King Xerxes calls on his wife, Queen Vashti, to come in and show how beautiful she is to all of his lords and generals and people. And if you were here with us some months ago, we did a whole series on Esther, and we discovered that meant some pretty dark things. And she refuses. She's like, I'm not putting myself out there for all of you people to gawk at that way. And so she refuses, and this leads King Xerxes to say, what am I supposed to do? And all of his advisors say, she shouldn't be queen anymore, banish her, kick her out, go find yourself a new queen. So they scour the entire Persian kingdom, and they host a beauty pageant. And there's about a year-long process of getting the ladies ready to go and impress the king. And so Queen Vashti is out of the picture, and this young Jewish girl, who her Jewish name is Hadassah, her Persian name is Esther, that's kind of helped use to hide her identity just a touch. But this young Jewish girl, she gets herself swept up in this empire-wide beauty pageant. She goes through the process of being prepared, the diet, the oils, the beauty treatments, all this stuff. And she spends a year getting ready. And after that year, we read this in Esther chapter 2, starting in verse 16. She was taken to King Ahasuerus. So just kind of for the real quick on that. If his name starts with an A, that's his Hebrew rendering. In the Greek rendering, they just called him Xerxes. So wherever you see Ahasuerus, you can say it if you want to sound really cool and smart. If you're like me and you're dumb, just say Xerxes. It's way easier. She was taken to King Xerxes in the palace in the 10th month, the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women. She walked in and he's like, that one. Like it happens very quickly. She won more favor and approval from him than did any of the other virgins, young ladies. He placed the royal crown on her head, made her queen in place of Vashti. The king held a great banquet for all his officials and staff. It was Esther's banquet. This is in honor of her. He freed his provinces from tax payments and gave gifts worthy of the king's bounty. So the way this story kicks off, the king of the most powerful empire in the world at the time, not happy with his wife, kicks her out of the position, hosts a beauty pageant. All the ladies from the empire show up, and he picks, out of all of these ladies, he picks Esther. And so somewhere around the year 479 BCE, Queen Esther becomes Queen Esther. And then they host this magnificent banquet to celebrate, which, by the way, is a theme through the book of Esther. About every other page, someone's throwing a banquet. All they did was eat and drink through the book of Esther. Like every other page is just another party, another party, another party. And that's one of the themes in the book. But the king hosts this huge banquet in honor of his new queen. And one of the things he decides to do is to free his provinces from tax payments. Let me tell you something. We often think we're way better than everybody who came before us, but they had something right here. We need to get the right person in politics married, where they're just like, hey, you know what? We're not going to collect taxes this year. You know, they got something on us right here. I can't ever imagine that happening, and neither can you, but that's what happened. So there's this massive banquet and celebration. The kingdom of Persia now has a new queen, Queen Esther. And this is where the story really begins to develop in its plot, okay? because in chapters 3 to 6, you're introduced to this character by the name of Haman. And Haman is not a good dude. And he begins to plot multiple arenas, if you will, kind of the downfall of the Jewish people. Now, just for a quick reference, we talked about this some months ago, but Haman's an interesting character because we discover that he is of the people of the Amalekites. He's from the line of King Agag. Now, if you go back in history, so we've been walking through the story, right? Go way back to the Game of Thrones series, where Israel was trying to figure out who's in charge around here anyway. Is it the judges? Is it God? Are we a monarchy? Are we a theocracy? Is there a king? Is there who's in charge around here anyway? Go back to that series and you'll bump into the first king of Israel, a man by the name of Saul. And one of the people groups that Saul absolutely demolishes in 1 Samuel chapter 15 is this little group called the Amalekites. So when we meet Haman and we find out that he is a descendant of the Amalekites, you immediately have this sense of, oh, there's a problem. There's a problem here because for over 500 years, the Jews and the Amalekites do not get along. And 500 years previous, the Israelites almost completely wiped them off the face of the earth. I mean, it was a brutal battle, and a few survive. Haman is one of the descendants of those people. So if you want to continue connecting dots in the story, that's another dot. Now, Haman shows up in the kingdom. He's looking for recognition from people. He's a very prideful man. And he puts himself in a position with the king where the king actually raises him to a position of power, second in the kingdom. I mean, he very quickly rises to prominence in the story. And now the plot begins to thicken because the queen is a Jew. And the second most powerful man in the empire hates Jews. And all of this is happening in the story without a single mention of God. These are just things that are operating. This is just the story that's playing out. It's like just the coincidence of life. This is just how the story's playing out. No mention of God, no mention of his will, no mention of what he's up to. Just a story plot line of a Jewish queen and the second in command who hates Jewish people. And these stories are about to, you can see it coming, they're about to collide. Now, one of Esther's family members is a man by the name of Mordecai. When Haman's pride gets the best of him, he wants everyone to bow down to him, and Esther's uncle does not. He's like, I'm not bowing to you. I don't bow to people. I only bow to God, like kind of a thing. He's like, I don't do this thing with humanity. And so he kind of puts that out there, and it just absolutely infuriates Haman. He initially thinks, I'm going to have this Mordecai dude executed, but then he finds out Mordecai is a Jew. And now 500 years of hatred comes into the picture, and Haman hatches a plan for genocide. You know what? Not just Mordecai. Let's kill and extinguish every Jew in the Persian Empire. And to discern when he's going to do that, he has his people bring in a set of dice. One set of dice has the months of their calendar, another has the days of the month, and they roll them. And here's what we find in Esther 3:7. In the first month, the month of Nisan, in King Xerxes' 12th year, the pure, that is the lot, the dice, was cast before Haman for each day in the month, and it fell on the 12th month, the month of Dar, and the 13th day of the month. So literally, he now has used dice to create and to find the day he is going to extinguish the Jewish people. And it's going to happen on the 13th day of Adar, which our March time frame moves around a bit, but in March-ish. So now here you have these Jews who are still in Persia. They've chosen not to go home. They aren't following the Torah. They're not able to do sacrifices. They don't have a temple. God is completely silent in the book. You have all of these things coming together, and now the dice are cast. And the end of the Jewish people is in sight. And the question for us now becomes, can God still be active when his people are in exile? Can God still be active and working when he is silent? All the way through the story, we have said that the big idea is God is relentlessly pursuing his creation. Can God still pursue his creation when he is silent? Can he still be in pursuit? And Esther begins to answer that for us, but before we get there, we have the image again of the upper and the lower story. The lower story being that which we experience in life. It's what you and I bump into on a daily basis. What's happening in the upper story is God is somehow at work. I don't see it yet, but maybe someday I will. But God is at work up here doing something. I just don't see it yet. And so here we have God being silent in the lower story, not a mention of God. Name is not used a single time in the book. And so the question becomes, if he's silent here, can he still be at work here? And this is kind of the question of the book of Esther. Can God still be active even though he's been absolutely silent? Word quickly spreads around the empire about the date that is in place for the Persians to wipe out the Jews. And once again, the king in this moment unknowingly signs his wife's death warrant. And at the same time, Haman has unknowingly put the queen's life at risk. Again, two stories about to absolutely collide, two plot lines about to collide, and still no mention of God. Now, what happens in the story as you continue reading is that Esther begins a back and forth with her uncle Mordecai. Mordecai thinks she should go and do something about this. She's like, here's a new set of clothes. You take a shower, clean yourself up, and you go talk to the king about this. He's like, no, you go talk to the king about it. And they just kind of get in this big back and forth about who's got to try to make this thing go away. And eventually, along the way, here's what we find. Mordecai, this is Stan's language, plays this kind of checkmate kind of move where Esther just is kind of stuck like, it's me, I've got to do something about this. Esther chapter 4, starting in verse 13. Mordecai told the messenger to reply to Esther. So this is their back and forth that's been going on. Don't think that you will escape the fate of all the Jews because you're in the king's palace. Yes, if you die from the thing, the king will be sad, but last time he lost a queen, he just went and held a beauty pageant and found another one. You're replaceable. Like, don't think you're gonna survive this just because of your position. If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will come to the Jewish people from another place. But you and your father's family will be destroyed. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. That just feels mean, Mordecai. Like it's just like the ultimate in checkmate. Like, you're in the position. Maybe this is exactly what you're supposed to be doing. You've got to do something about this. And she senses that. Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go and assemble all the Jews who can be found in Susa and fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my female servants will also fast in the same way. And after that, I will go to the king, even if it is against the law. If I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went and did everything Esther had commanded him. The interesting part to me is we make some assumptions about what the fasting there means. And yet, in the book of Esther, there's still no mention of God. God has not told her to talk to the king. God has not raised up prophets to tell her what to do. God has not done any of the kind of like normal stuff that he's been doing all throughout history. To this point, you just have a couple of people who are trying to save their lives and no mention of God. So you have to wrestle with, well, then what does that mean for me when God is silent in the coincidences of life, in the moments of life, when things are just happening? What does that mean for me? What am I supposed to do as a result. And that's kind of what's happening in this story. So you have these Jews who have now intermarried into this culture. They are not observing the rituals like they're supposed to. They're not following Torah. They have no place to sacrifice. God's presence is not there in power like it was in the temple way back when Solomon had built it. It kind of feels like, if you put yourself from a human perspective into the story, they're flying blind. God's not giving them direction. They don't sense that, like, okay, God is clearly saying X. They're just going, our lives are at stake. We got to do something. Like, we have to move into action at this point. All we've had so far is what reads as coincidence and luck. Oh, randomly Vashti just decides to disobey. Oh, randomly the king decides he's going to have a beauty pageant. Oh, randomly a Jewish woman is made the queen. Oh, randomly a hating person of the Jews shows up and is now second in command. Oh, randomly the throw of the dice. Oh, just coincidentally. And you see enough of these things start to stack up and you start to go, okay, I haven't heard God's name yet, but it's pretty clear God is still at work in this story, that God is up to something. But without specific direction from God, the best next step they can take is try not to die. Don't be a victim of genocide. Like, what can we do to prevent this from happening? Mordecai wins the verbal, mental chess match, and Esther says, if I perish, I perish. I'm going before the king, and I'm going to do what I can to make this go away. And still in the story, no mention of God. Now, she does go before the king, and then another one of those little coincidences happens, because if you go before the king without being summoned, you can be executed. But it just so happens this time the king sees Esther, and he's like, man, I love that woman. Come on up here, honey. And like, just, oh, she gets away with it. Okay, because most people who show up to the king, they're executed for doing this. She gets away with it. Oh, just another one of those little luck things. That maybe God is in this, but his name isn't mentioned, right? But you just kind of start to see it all fit together. She goes before the king, and she says this in Esther chapter 5. If it pleases the king, Esther replied, may the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for you. While drinking the wine, the king asked Esther, whatever you ask will be given to you. Whatever you want, even to half the kingdom will be done. That seems like a pretty good opening there for her to ask the question. But she answered, this is my petition and request. If I have found favor in the eyes of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition, may the king and Haman come to the banquet I will prepare for them. Tomorrow I will do what the king has asked. Now, to shorten up the story just a touch, the pride in this moment goes to Haman's head. He's like, the queen is inviting me to a king and I only kind of dinner? Oh man, I'm fancy now. And it kind of goes to his head, even more than his pride along the way in the story. And literally that night, he is so bothered because of what's about to happen. He is so bothered by the fact that Mordecai won't bow down to him that his family's like, well, why don't you just kill him? So he's like, all right, fine. I'm going to build a 75-foot tall gallows, and I'm going to hang Mordecai. That's how mad I am. I'm second in command over the most powerful empire on earth, but one guy won't bow to me, so I need genocide and a hanging to make me feel better. I mean, there's not many better examples in the Bible of a very mentally weak human being whose pride is ultimately going to destroy him. But this plot is running primarily chapters 3 to 6. And then we get to this place where the two plots finally collide, and it collides in chapters 7 to 8, where we find Jewish deliverance. At the second banquet, so the next day, that Queen Esther was hosting, she finally makes that request of the king she's been trying to get up the guts to say. And so here's where we finally have the request. Esther chapter 7, starting in verse 3. Queen Esther answered the king, if I have found favor with you, your majesty, if the king is pleased, spare my life. This is my request. And spare my people. This is my desire. For my people and I have been sold to destruction, death, and annihilation. Now I want you to just try to mentally put yourself into this scene. You're the king. You've signed the death warrant. You didn't know your wife was a part of it. Because she's been hiding her identity. She changed her name. She's not Hadassah in the palace. She's Esther, Persian name. She's hiding her identity. The king doesn't know. And now he's sitting there and he's hearing this news that someone's trying to kill his wife. And you're the most powerful man on the globe. Just put yourself in that seat for just a moment and imagine how you might respond. Because I think you might respond about like how King Xerxes responded. He just kind of goes off. Who came up with something like this? Who's trying to kill you and your family and your people? And Esther, if you just read on through there, Esther just goes, come on. She's just that guy right there. And she's literally set him up for the last 2 days for this moment to point at him and go, this guy is trying to kill me and to wipe out my people. You might be able to imagine the king doesn't take the news well. And he gets pretty angry. Angry enough, he leaves the entire scene, and the Bible says he goes out to walk in the garden. My assumption is that just means that he's trying to process what he just heard, that someone's trying to kill his wife, and that it was Haman, and this feels now underhanded, and he has signed the death warrant. So, I mean, the king is processing some news, right? So he goes out, he's walking in the garden, he's trying to get his thoughts together. What in the world's going on? In the meantime, as he's walking in the garden, the Bible continues telling the story from inside the palace. And Haman goes into beg mode. I mean, the pride immediately disappears. The ego immediately goes away, right? And he starts to beg. Esther's not having it, and so Haman decides, I'm gonna go all in on this, and I'm gonna throw my body onto her and beg. And just about the time he's laid across her lap and is on top of her, guess who decides to come back in? I'm done processing. The king. He walks back in, and Haman is on top of his wife, begging for his life. This is all playing out, right? And the king just absolutely loses it. Who in the world do you think you are? You're going to come in here and not only threaten my wife, but now you're going to assault her? Like, the king he's having none of it. He just has like this moment of, it just cuts off, right? And then before the king, or right as the king is finishing this statement, the Bible says guards arrive and put a hood over Haman's head. They're like, you don't even get to look at the king or the queen anymore because of this shameful behavior. So they put a hood over his head and just drag him out. And he kind of goes away for the moment. And then the king continues to process, what am I supposed to do? Esther chapter 7, verses 9 and 10, one of his eunuchs, Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs said, there's a gallows 75 feet tall at Haman's house. He was going to use it for Mordecai. Been so upset the guy won't bow down to him, he's going to hang him on a 75-foot tall pole. It's in his backyard. He built it last night. Mordecai's the one who gave the report that saved the king. So the part of the story I've left out so far is that there was an assassination attempt on the king's life, and the guy that saved him was Mordecai the Jew. And the king finds out about it, and now Mordecai's got some weight behind his name. I mean, just plot line after plot line just crash together in this moment, and it doesn't go well for Haman. I mean, it doesn't go well for him. The king says, hang him on it. So the very gallows you built for the Jew you hate in your backyard is now the one you're dying on. Like, the king has a very swift and just response to, you're trying to kill my wife? Like, I don't think so. And so these stories have collided. Hang him on it. They hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai, and then the king's anger subsided. The mastermind of the genocide is now out of the way. The problem is that the king's edict still exists and that the Jews' lives are still on the line. But because of Mordecai's faithfulness and Esther's faithfulness, King Xerxes raises Mordecai very quickly to a position of power. He basically takes Haman's position in the palace, second in control over the kingdom. And the king gives him his signet ring and says, you do what you think you need to do to save your people. And so what Haman does, as the story kind of concludes, is he writes another law, another edict signed by the king that says, if you want to attack the Jews on the 13th of Adar, as the first edict said, you're welcome to. Just know we're also giving them authority to defend themselves. And so what was going to be a genocidal day turned into battles, small battles across the empire. And then this is when you get to chapters 9 and 10, and there's this kind of liberation and celebration kind of a theme. When they finally get to that day, people actually still tried to kill some of the Jews. On that day, the number of people killed in the fortress of Susa was reported to the king. The king said to Queen Esther, in the fortress of Susa, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men. Now, probably both sides lost people, but 500 across an empire of millions of people is pretty tame compared to what that day was going to be. Because that day was going to be one-sided, lopsided in one direction, and the Jews were going to face extinction who had stayed in Persia. So 500 men are killed, including Haman's 10 sons. And so this generational enmity between the Amalekites all the way back to King Saul has kind of come to an end. And it's not worked out very well for the Amalekites to try to fight against Israel. And so that comes to an end. But the Jews in Susa had assembled on the 13th and 14th days of the month. They rested on the 15th, and it became a day of feasting and rejoicing. And still to this day, they celebrate the Feast of Purim. And they dress up in the funniest costumes you've ever seen, and they celebrate, and they party, and they rejoice because of this story that comes from the cast of the dice, the coincidence of a gamble, the luck of a beauty pageant, the randomness of somehow a Jewish woman becomes queen of Persia. And all the way through, God's name is not mentioned a single time. And the question was, can God still be active in the coincidence? And you start to pile up all the coincidences, and you start to go, oh, it actually seems like maybe God is very heavily involved in what is happening. Even when God is silent, he's still at work, organizing, moving, making history move to a specific destination. He's still at work. God's still working in the coincidence of a beauty pageant, an assassination plot, a genocide plot, in the honoring of Mordecai and the honoring of Haman. God is working in the silence, relentlessly pursuing his creation. Now, in a book of the Bible that does not even mention God's name, I think one of the really big questions that pops up for us is, what am I supposed to do when God is silent in my life and I need answers? What am I supposed to do? How do I live from here? What next steps am I supposed to take? And the reality, again, is, we could rattle off a list of a whole bunch of things. There's probably a list we could come up with, but allow me to just offer you a few. Allow me to offer you 3 potential next steps that you can take very easily today in 2025, right now, this morning, if you want to. Just some simple next steps you can take that even when God is silent, just take the next step. Just do the next right thing until whatever God is up to in the upper story starts to become clear in the lower. But in the meantime, stay faithful when God is silent. So what are those areas in which we can stay faithful even when God is silent? Here's a few. We talk about this in here at LSCC as a rhythm or a practice. Just getting into the rhythm of living a certain type of way, into the practice of doing specific types of things. We call them worship, community, and mission. And we invite people to take take the next step into one of these practices, into one of these rhythms. Just see what God's up to. You may not know yet, you may not be sure, but just take the next step and see what God's up to. So when it comes to worship, I know I'm the lead pastor, so this just sounds like, well, of course you would say that. Well, of course I would say that. When it comes to worship, can I just encourage you to show up again next week? All through the week, God may be silent for you and you may not be sure what in the world's going on. Can I just encourage you, show up again next week? I've had people come up to me when I am going through a sermon or whatever, and I didn't even talk about anywhere near the thing that they want to ask me about. But they come up and I had a lady one time come up and say, have you been reading my diary? And I'm like, I didn't even talk about that thing. What are you? But something sometimes happens on a Sunday where you just get a sense that, okay, I think God is saying this, and he's been silent on it for a while. I need to move in this direction. And that's not because the guys who preach are that good. In fact, we're constantly probably in the way. It's because God is still at work pursuing you. He's relentlessly pursuing his creation. He has something for you. So just show up again next week. You never know. Maybe next week God will have the thing you've been looking for. Maybe it's the week after, but don't give it up. Just show up next Sunday. See what God's got. When it comes to community, we always invite people to get into community groups. There's something about walking with other people who have similar stories, who are going through similar things, who are in similar stages of life, and you have someone now to talk to about that and learn some information and go, oh, okay, here's what I've been trying to do in my story. What have you been trying to do? Well, here's what I'm up to, and here's what I think God's doing with me, and then here's this, and here's what I think I'm learning from God. And then usually it's the people I spend time with who just have no sense of what that is, who, when you get to the question about community groups, are you walking with any other believers at all in any capacity? The answer is usually no. And when you walk with other people, you get to learn. You get to be a part of, okay, here's where their journey's gone. Here's what God's showing them. Maybe there's something in that, and I need to learn that, and I need to grow in this way. I need people. I need people around me who are walking in the same direction I am. Get me into community. And then the third, we talk about mission. And just to keep this super simple for us this morning, can I just encourage you that there are a lot of areas of our church where people are constantly serving, and we need other people to serve as well. It may not even be necessarily right away in an area of giftedness and passion, but maybe as you take the next step in, you discover what that is, and you're like, okay, I think God is asking me to do, I think God is up to this. I think God is headed in this direction with me. Could I just invite you to consider finding a place here on Sunday morning or during the week to serve? Everything from community kids to our tech worship, our security teams, our greeters, our cafe. There's opportunities all around for you to be involved. And so if I could be so bold as to say, stay faithful when God is silent, and part of being faithful means just do the next right thing. Just keep taking the next right step. And sometimes for us, that's just show up again next week, walk with some other people you may be able to learn from, and find a way to use your gifts and talents on a Sunday morning. Serve, be a part of the mission of the church. Each and every week we pause here and we try to go to the cross and we share together in communion. Each of you should have hopefully some bread and some juice. And here's what I'd like to remind you of. something that kind of helps me a little bit in this is to be reminded that even Jesus experiences God in the silence. So when we go to the cross, we're reminded of Jesus' death. We're reminded of his body that's broken, his blood that is shed. That is absolutely a part of this. But before we get to the cross, there are some moments that happen. Like Jesus takes his disciples into the garden, and Jesus steps away from them and begins to pray. And Jesus is going to pray for hours. It's going to happen multiple times. But Jesus prays this: "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." Jesus is intending to be obedient and to stay faithful to the mission, but he's also asking God if there's another way to accomplish the same thing that doesn't require a cross, because this will not be pleasant. If it is possible, let this cup pass from me. He prays this 3 times over the course of multiple hours in the middle of the night in the garden. And you know what the answer from God is? Silence. Not a single response. Jesus at this point will be betrayed. He'll be arrested. He'll be put on trial. He'll be beaten to within an inch of his life. They'll put thorns on his head. I mean, he's going to go through it. He'll be condemned, and then eventually he'll be put on a cross, and he'll be crucified. And on the cross, Jesus in the Bible is recorded, I think it's about 7 things that Jesus says. And one of the things that Jesus says around 3 p.m. from Matthew chapter 27 says, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, my God, why have you abandoned me?" Jesus experienced God in the silence, and yet just stayed faithful to the next thing. I hope none of you are facing a cross in the coming days. I don't think that's your story, probably. It was Jesus' story. It was his mission, and he stayed faithful even when God was silent. So communion becomes an opportunity for us to reflect on the cross of Jesus. The bread reminds us of his body that was broken. The juice reminds us of his blood that was shed. And maybe for you in this moment, if God has been silent for you, maybe for you this is a moment where you spend a little bit of time with Jesus and you say, I will just take the next right step. I will stay faithful while you are silent, and I'll be okay with that. And I'll just stay faithful. Going to give you a moment to reflect and to pray. And here in just a moment, Kevin will be back up and close our time together. Let's eat.
Thanks again for tuning in today to our podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow, subscribe, share, and watch for special episodes. For more information about LS Community Church, visit our website at lsccKC.org or follow us on social media.